All right, hey everyone, I'm here with Junghoon Lee at Picwell.
Hi.
We're going to talk a little bit about career decisions for technical people. At Picwell, we've got software developers, we've got machine learning engineers, and we've got analysts. And we're going to talk to Junghoon a little bit about the roles that they play and the types of people that are in those roles. So thank you. Excited to talk to Junghoon. So,
Hi, Ben.
hi Junghoon,
Yeah.
thanks for joining me. You and I have had lots of conversations about these types of topics. I think they're some of the funnest things to talk about. And you and I have talked about software developers, machine learning engineers, and analysts. And you can define those for me to get started. It'd be great if we just hear like what are those roles? How do you define those?
Sure. So at Pickwell, we have mainly two groups of people, just by title. So we have software developers and we have data scientists. And Ben, what you sort of teed off is like, so under data scientists, at least I believe personally that there are like relatively two distinct groups of people. One is the machine learning engineer or scientist, and the other is the analyst. So we want to talk a little bit more about those three groups. So basically software engineers, machine learning engineers, and then finally analysts.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah.
So the data scientists will share the same title, but there's two different sort of types
Right.
of data
At
scientists, and then
least,
there's software engineers. So just
exactly.
why don't you start by just talking about, just define the three of those for us.
Right. So the main role of software developers at Pickwell, and I believe this is more or less general in any other places, is like they build our system basically because we have to provide recommendations reliably and consistently over a long period of time with very small downtime. Their main role is to make sure that we have such a system and we can add features that users love to have. So that's mainly our software engineers' responsibility. And then we have the machine learning engineers. So these people, to me, are about finding algorithms that identify useful patterns in data. And in our case, we use a relatively large data set. So there's also a challenge in terms of scale. We have to shift through a large data set to identify those patterns. It's nearly impossible for humans to do it. Humans are very good at small scale.
Yep.
But as soon as you go into like 20 different features and a few thousand data, humans are not very good. So the role of the machine learning engineers are to be able to find algorithms that will find those patterns for us.
Broadly speaking, scalable
Exactly.
across different domains, et cetera.
Exactly, and this is one of the key parts of our product. Things like people like you,
Yep.
the machine learning algorithms are actually identifying those for us. And finally, there are analysts, those people that I consider analysts. So these people are very interested in data. They want to ask a lot of questions about the data. And at Pickwell, one of their key responsibilities are to gain insight in data and try to provide useful reports for our customers. So that's their role.
Got it. So we've got software developers on one hand, data scientists that break down into machine learning engineers and analysts. Could you
Right.
just talk about what are the different motivations of those three groups? So when they come to work every day, how are they thinking about the world? What makes them good at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, this is very my personal
Sure.
opinion. I think there's a lot of sort of debate going
It's
on.
the only opinion that
Yeah,
matters.
yeah.
Junghoon.
Thank you. So for instance, developers. I've worked with quite a few developers in my current role and my previous role. One distinguishing characteristics that I find, at least compared to me, is like they care about the maintainability of the system very much. So they always ask these questions, if we make this decision right now, what is the downstream impact, let's say 1 year from now? Will this decision backfire because someone who's maintaining that system in about a year, and that may even be me, may make a mistake because of a bad decision that we made. So they're very, very interested in building a maintainable and also very scalable system. So that's one sort of distinguishing characteristics that I see in very good developers. For machine learning engineers or machine learning scientists, whichever way you want to call it, they're very, very interested in coming up with this algorithm. Sometimes the algorithms are not super scalable. Sometimes they're fragile. Yet they really want to find this algorithm. And they're kind of lazy. I mean, developers are also lazy in a very distinct way. I think both of them are. They are lazy in the sense that they don't want to do repeated tasks. So like for a machine learning engineer, we don't want to go through the data point by point personally to figure something out. we want to develop an algorithm, even though that may take more effort. We want to do that so that we don't have to do it manually. Developers also act in a similar way. And so that's kind of at least a distinguishing characteristic that I see in many good machine learning engineers. And then finally, analysts, they're very intensely curious about the data set. So machine learning engineers, they want to build an algorithm, hopefully, that works for any data set, which is usually doesn't work as you hope, but analysts, they are very, very interested in a specific data set, and they have a lot of these questions. And they have this sort of persistence and diligence to actually go after those questions and try to find the answers. Even if they have to go at sort of data record by record, they find it, and which is another, I think, a characteristic of good analysts.
And I think as we've talked about this before, if I can recall, you talk about sort of that machine learning analyst might generally have a little bit more of maybe an academic pursuit.
Right.
You know, they're thinking about this big picture where they can impact the world broadly.
Right.
Whereas an analyst probably has a little bit more of a subject matter expertise.
Right.
In our case, in health insurance or health plan design or maybe even
Right.
behavioral economics, something very specific that they can apply that to.
Right.
And because they have that specific interest, they're much more interested in learning about the actual, about how your machine learning algorithm as a machine learning engineer can be applied to their space.
Exactly.
And they're more patient to dig into the data for a particular
Right.
area and more interested in that. And also, I think you had told me they're a little bit more practical, I think is what you said to me.
Right.
So they know when enough is enough. They know when they've, for their field, whatever they're interested in, when you need to go further or don't need to go any further.
I think that pragmatism is important for all three groups. However, yes, I think to be a good analyst, they have to be able to ask a good question,
Right.
and be able to decide when to stop.
Yep.
Because you can spend your whole life trying to answer that question. Right. It's just that the gain that you'll get is become very marginal at some
Sure.
point. And so a lot of these good analysts, they actually know when to stop.
Right.
And yes, I think the pragmatic is a really good word. Also, they have very good sort of common sense.
Yep.
Again, to find good questions. Is this a worthwhile question that we should ask?
Yeah. So Junghoon, let's get to know you a little bit better. You, of course, are at different times working in a small company. You're operating principally as a machine learning engineer, but oftentimes you're having to do software development.
Yes.
In order to do that, sometimes getting into the analyst side. Could you talk a little bit about how that plays out for you, and as people are thinking about careers, how do you start to learn what you like to do, and how do you end up where you
Right.
are today?
Right. So I think knowing what you like to do is always kind of difficult, and sometimes it takes time. Some lucky people, they find it in their 20s.
Yep.
Like me, it took me a while to figure that out. I think I finally learned it towards the end of my grad school,
Okay.
after trying this and that. And trying this and that kind of helps in my current role, because again, we're a small company, and you have to do what you need to do to sort of make it work. So yes, I do a little bit of development with help from our senior developers. I also do some analysis because sometimes we're short of hand, and you have to do it.
Got it.
And again, that sort of helps me to reinforce my sort of thinking about what I like and what I don't, to be honest.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you just talk a little bit about how each of the roles play out at Picwell? More of the interaction.
Right.
You as a machine learning engineer, how do you interact with software developers and analysts?
Right.
Talk about that. It's probably different all the time, but
Right. So yeah, so like for analysts, sort of the way I usually interact with, like, if there's kind of a problem or insight that we want to gain from data, I try to design like a few questions to sort of tee off that project for an analyst. And we have really good analysts here. And once I pose some reasonable questions, they're very, very good at sort of refining those questions to get much better ones and also good answers. And that's how I usually interact with analysts. And they are
so
very
there's some
good
back and forth.
Yeah,
between
definitely
the two of
back
you.
and forth. But like the great thing is, like, we really have very good talented analysts. Like, I think Sam is a great analyst. Even though he's a chief economist, or
Yeah.
maybe because he's a chief economist.
Right.
He figures out the question with my sort of a draft, very rough questions. the way I work with a lot of developers is, again, I get help from them to make my code more maintainable. I think that's what I really enjoy doing. So like I can create something that roughly works. And then I bring some of my senior developers in and say, okay, what do you think about the code? And they usually say, that's crap. But then they definitely help me to improve that. So that's one way that we interact. Another way we interact is like our product has sort of machine learning algorithms at the center or the heart. And I try to sort of shape our system. So I'm not a full-time architect, but I try to help our senior developers come up with a better architecture where our machine learning algorithm can function more effectively and also scale much better. So I think that part I also like very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Junghoon. I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. That's all we have for today, talking about software developers, machine learning engineers, and analysts, how they interact. Look forward to the next time.
Bye.